Welcome everyone to our final Historia Medica of this year. And our speaker today is Dr. Susan Burns, who is joining us from Chicago. She is a professor of history and East Asian languages and civilization at the University of Chicago, specializing in 19th century Japan. And her recent research has explored the history of medicine in the Tokugawa period, particularly looking at questions related to the history of the body as it was conceptualized within medical and legal discourses. And thank you all so much for joining us. I'm sure that this is going to be a fantastic talk. We will have some time at the end for Q&A. Please use the Q&A function here through Zoom, and we will get to those as we receive them. So, all right, Dr. Burns, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that very kind introduction, and hello, everyone. The paper I'm presenting today is actually drawn from a book that I've been working on this year. I've been on research leave, which explores medical modernization and the rise of public health in late 19th century Tokyo. And the first chapter I wrote is actually the one that is the basis of this talk, which I was working on last summer when we were on total lockdown in Chicago due to the COVID situation. And as I was writing it, I was really thinking about the coronavirus and our reaction to it in the US. So maybe you want to keep that in mind as you're listening. In July 1879, a 15-year-old boy named Hori Naokichi, who lived in Tokyo with his parents and his siblings, fell ill with cholera. He was just one of more than 160,000 people in Japan who would be infected with this disease in this single year. Now, having heard rumors of the boy's condition, a hygiene officer, that is a policeman who was charged with enforcing public health laws, made his way to the Hori home, where he ordered Naokichi's transfer to a quarantine hospital. This is what was required by the public health regulations of the day. However, his parents, Tsunejiro and Oman, refused to comply. As neighbors and the officer argued with his parents, Naokichi's condition continued to worsen, and within hours he was dead. In the days that followed, the family's tragedy deepened, as did their intransigence. First, a second son fell ill, followed by a daughter. Both children passed away as the parents barricaded their home, refusing to allow either the removal of their dead children or the disinfection of their home. It was only when Oman, the wife, developed symptoms of cholera that her husband finally relented and allowed hygiene officers to take her to one of the 4 quarantine hospitals in the city. Now, the outbreak of 1879 was but one of a series of devastating cholera epidemics in late 19th century Japan. Others were in 1877, 1882, 1886, 1890, 1891, 1895, and 1896. In total, cholera caused more than 400,000 deaths nationwide in these years, and Tokyo was particularly hard hit. In the 1882 epidemic, the first one for which we have infection and mortality rates for the city, more than 11% of all cases were in Tokyo, although the city's population was only 3.2% of the country's total population. The percentage of cases in Tokyo in subsequent epidemics was lower, but it continued to be disproportionate in relation to the city's population. Now, we know about the terrible toll that the disease took on the Hori family because the Yomiuri newspaper, one of the most popular newspapers of the day, reported on it, albeit as a cautionary tale. According to the newspaper, Tsunejiro was both arrogant and ignorant for putting his family and community at risk by refusing to respect public health regulations. However, in point of fact, it is unlikely that his compliance would have saved his children. The mortality rate inside Tokyo's crowded and understaffed quarantine hospitals was shockingly high. Indeed, cholera patients were more likely to die in a quarantine hospital than outside one. Now, in my presentation today, I want to explore the impact of cholera upon the cityscape and people of Tokyo. Over the course of 3 decades, local and national officials tried to understand why cholera flourished in the city, and they tried to develop policies to control the disease. The repeated epidemics in Tokyo alarmed bureaucrats at all levels of government. As Japan's capital and the epicenter of its project of modernization, Tokyo was intended to showcase the country's accomplishments, but cholera, in fact, exposed the city's vulnerabilities. Although it was recognized early on that the city's aging water supply system and practices for sewage removal contributed to the spread of cholera, the government was slow to act to improve the city's infrastructure. Instead, public health measures focused on the city's residents, their domestic spaces, and their daily habits. Quarantine hospitals were posed as the solution to cholera, but in fact, they revealed and deepened the city's spatial and social divisions. Now, the 1879 epidemic was in fact the fourth to strike Japan. The disease was first introduced to the country in the autumn of 1822 in the midst of the first global cholera epidemic, which began in Calcutta in 1817 and quickly spread following the overlapping routes of imperialism and commerce to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and China. The disease was introduced to Japan via trade, either from the Korean Peninsula or via Nagasaki from the Dutch colony of Batavia in what is now Indonesia. Over the course of October and November of 1822, cholera spread throughout Western Honshu, the main island. Like people in other affected countries, the Japanese were stunned by the speed with which the disease killed. And the term cholera, which the Dutch introduced to Japan, was quickly transformed in the vernacular, reflecting their firsthand experience with the disease. It came to be called Mika Korori. And Mika means 3 days, and Korori is actually the sound of something falling. So it means something like 3 days and fall over dead. And this, I think, is a reference to the rapid progression of the disease and the sudden death that often resulted. Now, when people in Japan wrote the word korori or korera, they wrote it with Chinese characters, and they chose 3 characters: tiger, wolf, and badger. And I have this image here, which is actually a medicine advertisement, a sort of patent medicine advertisement from the mid-1880s. But you can see this image here of the animal is actually, this is cholera as it's imagined. So this kind of fierce imaginary beast that combined attributes of the tiger, wolf, and badger was meant to convey the ferocity of the disease, or perhaps the terror that it evoked in the people who came to experience it. Now, in this instance, Edo, as Tokyo was known until 1868, was spared by the weather rather than any human endeavor at disease control. Cholera is caused by a bacteria called Vibrio cholerae that originated in the warm waters of the Ganges Delta. Now, when ingested by human beings, the cholera bacteria causes explosive diarrhea and vomiting, and these fluids contain high numbers of the bacteria. Poor hygiene and lack of sanitation allow for the recontamination of water, and the disease can then be spread widely and easily. Washing one's hand in contaminated water can be a vector for transmission, as can handling the soiled clothing or bedcloths of an infected person, or eating raw fruits and vegetables that have been washed in infected water. What's interesting, though, is that the cholera bacteria cannot survive long in water that is colder than about 10 degrees Celsius, with the result that in Japan, as elsewhere, there's a very cyclical nature to epidemics, which typically begin in the summer and then end with the onset of cold weather. So in this 1822 epidemic, because it's introduced in the fall, actually is fairly short-lived, and the city of Edo is spared. Now, when cholera returns to Japan in 1858, it's brought by an American naval ship called the Mississippi that arrives in the port of Nagasaki from China with infected sailors on board. So it comes in the early summer and it has lots of time to spread. And by August, cholera reaches Edo. The city's officials responded as best they could by distributing broadsheets, these one-piece sort of newsletters, that one-page newsletters that urge people to do things like bind their abdomens with cotton cloth to keep it warm, to avoid eating any raw fruits or vegetables. That's good advice. They also suggested possible treatments such as drinking tea laced with sugar and shochu, a distilled liquor. Now, this advice too may have had some efficacy because heat and alcohol would have killed the bacteria, and the ingestion of fluids may have helped combat the dehydration that killed most people who are infected with cholera. Meanwhile, the people responded to cholera as they did to other forms of epidemic disease that they knew well, such as measles and smallpox, which were very common in Japan. They attached amulets to their doorways and charms to their persons and conducted rituals to appease the deity of the epidemic that they thought was responsible for the disease. And this is another medicine advertisement. And you see here the patient, and he's just taken the medicine. And this is the cholera deity supposedly leaving his body. This image is interesting to me for another reason, because it shows a kind of typical sick room in this period of a wealthy person who could have bought this rather expensive medicine. And as you can see, it's crowded with people who are in close contact with the patient. And so these are the conditions that sort of made it easy to spread cholera from one person to another. Now, contemporary accounts of the epidemic in Edo describe how the crematoria in the city and local graveyards were overwhelmed by the unprecedented numbers of deaths. And that's what this image here is showing, this very crowded crematorium. And these are the caskets here. They look like barrels, but people were sort of placed in them in a kind of fetal position. So by the end of this epidemic, it's estimated that at least 40,000 people in the city had died. Now, the 1858 cholera epidemic occurred during the turbulent political moment that followed the signing of a series of treaties between the Tokugawa shogunate and the US, Britain, and other European countries. And these treaties created so-called treaty ports that were open to foreign residents and trade. It was the treaty that was signed with the US that had allowed the ship Mississippi to come into Nagasaki with infected crewmen aboard. And the open ports would continue to be very important for the transfer of the disease from outside of Japan to the country itself. Now, so like other countries in this period, the new Japanese government tried to enforce a maritime quarantine that would allow it to inspect ships and to keep any that had infected people aboard from mooring in Japanese ports. But this was rejected by governments such as that of Germany, Britain, and France, which argued that Japan could not enforce quarantine regulations without their consent. And the new and still very weak government of Japan had little power to resist this. So preventing the introduction of cholera was impossible, and this made curtailing its spread domestically all the more crucial. Now, beginning with the outbreak of 1877, Tokyo's prefectural government ordered that doctors, the heads of families, owners of inns and shops and factories, and the staff of school notify them in case of any suspected incident of cholera. And beginning in 1882, this information began to be compiled at the level of the ward. Tokyo in this period had 15 wards. And the compilation of these public health statistics make it possible to understand which parts of the city were most affected by cholera. And it quickly became clear that cholera did not impact all parts of the city equally. Instead, outbreaks were centered in the wards in the western part of the city, that would be over here, particularly places like Kanda, Asakusa, Honjo, Fukagawa, and Kyobashi. And in fact, for the period between 1882 and 1890, 60% of all cases in the city were in these 5 wards. These were, to be sure, some of the most populated parts of the city, but population density can't account for the prevalence of the disease. Now, by this time, officials in Japan had an understanding, albeit not an entirely accurate one, of how cholera was spread, the role that human waste played in the transmission of the disease was known in Japan by at least 1871. And that's because there was a real industry of translating Western language medical and other scientific texts in Japan in this period. In 1880, the Home Ministry informed the Tokyo Metropolitan Police and the Tokyo Prefectural Government, which shared responsibility for public health in the city, quote, "The disease poison is contained in the vomit and diarrhea of the sick person, and if it enters into dirty and polluted water or soil, its propagative power increases as it moves. It enters drinking water and from there into the human body where it multiplies, causing the symptoms of diarrhea and vomiting." Now, the notion that the virulence of disease poison increased due to exposure to other forms of contamination was, to be sure, mistaken. But the new knowledge that cholera was spread via the water supply reinforced growing concerns about Tokyo's drinking water and sanitation. Now, at this time, Tokyo still relied upon an antiquated system of aqueducts that were constructed in the 16th and early 17th century for its drinking water. The first of these, known as the Kanda Aqueduct, moved water from the Inokashira Pond, located 20 kilometers outside of the city, through open channels until it reached Sekiguchi at Koishikawa, which is up here. So it's coming from way out here in the suburbs to Koishikawa in open conduits, and then it enters into a system of wooden and bamboo pipes, and this is what moves the water around the city. Several decades later, a second aqueduct was built, and it moved water from the Tama River, which is out this way, over 43 kilometers, again through open conduits, until it reached Yotsuya. And then again, it enters into a system of underground bamboo and wooden pipes. And then the water moves into these, I guess it would be the southern wards of the city. Now, there's a river that runs here, the Sumida River, and that was where the remaining water in the aqueduct system would just flow into the river there. Now, in the 1870s, as before, there were many parts of the city that did not have access to aqueduct water, for better or worse. The aqueducts were never extended west of the Sumidagawa, so these 2 wards here had no water, and these wards up here also were not served by the aqueducts. And then there were some parts of the city over here and in Kanda that were just too high, and there was no way to move the water to the higher ground. So in these areas, people relied upon well water. Now, these wards, particularly over here on the western side of the Sumida River, were located in the lowest parts of the city, and groundwater tended to be brackish and unsuitable for drinking. So people in these parts of the city actually bought water from water vendors, many of whom gathered it from the points on the Sumida River where the aqueducts were releasing their excess water. Now, in the early modern period, considerable effort was made to maintain the purity of the water supply. For example, early on, 5.5 meters on either side of the open conduits was designated as a buffer, and people were not allowed to use that area for agriculture or any kind of other task. And the idea was to ensure that no pollution entered into the water supply. And villagers who lived in proximity to the channels were also charged with ensuring that they were regularly dredged and cleaned and so on. But by the 1870s, these safeguards had largely been abandoned, and reports from the 1870s attest to the dismal state of the open channels. Garbage dumps were found on the banks, and household garbage and other waste, including even animal corpses, was routinely found in the water fences outside the city. In addition, we know that local people had begun to use the conduits to wash their clothes and their dishes and for other kinds of domestic tasks. Now, even before the connection between the water supply and the spread of cholera was recognized, there was a lot of concern about Tokyo's water. In 1874, the Ministry of Education hired a German scientist named George Martin to carry out tests of Tokyo's water. And he found that the water at its source in the Tamagawa River was very pure. However, that as the water moved into the city, it came to be contaminated by high levels of organic matter. And then according to Martin's analysis, the other aqueduct, the one that drew water from the Inokashira Pond, was even more polluted, and he found evidence of very high levels of human and animal waste in the water. And reacting to this knowledge that the water was being contaminated, in 1874, the Home Ministry ordered another European scientist. This was a man named Cornelius van Doren, who was a Dutch civil engineer, to draw up a plan for modernizing Tokyo's water supply. His plan called for the development of a system of reservoirs to bring water to areas not serviced by the aqueducts, and to create steam-powered water purifying facilities for the areas that were served by the aqueducts. Now, Van Doren's plan didn't address the decaying pipes beneath the city or other aspects of the aging original aqueduct system. And I think this is because he was an employee of the government and was very well aware that the Japanese government at this moment was very stretched financially. And so he tried to develop a plan that was economical. Even so, Van Doren estimated that the renovations would cost about 1.5 million yen to carry out the initial construction, with an additional 185,000 yen required each year to maintain it. Tokyo Prefecture's tax revenue in 1879 was 268,000 yen. So you can see that there's simply no way that the prefecture could carry out the plan without funds from the central government, and they simply were not forthcoming. Now, the contamination of the city's water supply was intimately connected to another aspect of Tokyo's urban infrastructure. Japan's farmers had long utilized human waste as fertilizer, but as the population of the city grew over the 17th, 18th century, farmers in surrounding villages began to increase food production through intensive agriculture. When waste produced locally was no longer sufficient to meet their needs, farmers turned to the city itself for this resource, and human manure produced by city residents became a valuable commodity. Agents from agricultural villages outside the city forged contracts with specific landowners that gave them the right to remove the waste from household toilets for a price. In many localities, the actual work of removing waste from toilets of specific homes was carried out by villagers who traveled to Edo with produce to sell in the morning. In the afternoon, they cleaned toilets and returned home with buckets of excrement. Villages with good access to waterways had another option. They could transport human waste via boat. Now, early public health officials in Tokyo realized that the human waste being carried through the city's streets was a problem, but they were even more concerned with the movement of waste that could not be seen. That is, the waste that moved underground when human waste from toilets seeped into the groundwater and into the aqueduct water. Toilets in Edo and early Tokyo were quite simple. Waste was collected in underground containers made of wood, earthenware, or in the best case of ceramic. These containers could be easily removed by accessing an opening in the wooden floor through which the waste was deposited. Beginning in the 1870s, public health officials became particularly concerned about two types of toilets. The so-called street side toilets. I've given you an image of one here. These were public toilets of a type that lined the city streets and were available to passersby. That was one kind of toilet they were concerned with. And the second were the shared communal toilets used by residents in so-called back alley tenements. And I'll talk more about them in a moment. In the Edo period, street toilets were typically constructed by human manure agents on private property. These benefited the owners in two ways. Not only were they paid for the excrement gathered from the toilets, but they also charged a small fee for the use of the toilets. And that these toilets were really important given that many of Tokyo's poorer residents did not have access to toilets near their residences. And thus the number of public toilets grew steadily over time from about 160 in the late 18th century to more than 1,300 by the 1870s. In the 1870s, officials of some of the city wards began to call for better maintenance of these toilets. They wanted them to be kept cleaner. And so there's this new kind of idea emerging that the provision of toilets to urban residents is a kind of public service. However, their utility notwithstanding, these street toilets were often crudely constructed and they were notoriously filthy. Officials in the city were perhaps even more concerned about the communal toilets in so-called back alley tenements. So this is just a simple line drawing of a back alley tenement, and you can see the main streets and the storefronts. And then you have these areas here, which would be one-room dwellings with a sort of entry point here. These were one-story wooden structures that were built to house the poor and working class people in small single-room apartments that were typically 4.5 tatami mats in size. The buildings were sandwiched between parallel streets lined with homes and businesses of more prosperous city residents, and tenement dwellers shared communal toilets and a well. And so you can see here, the toilets are generally adjacent to the well, and you see it here. This is, it's from a popular fictional text about the life among Tokyo's working class. And you can see the garbage dump here, a well here, toilet here, and then people doing household tasks and gathering water and so in proximity to these public facilities. Now, as this map indicates, pockets of poverty were scattered around Tokyo in the 1870s and forward into the 20th century. And slum districts were often located in close proximity to more prosperous neighborhoods. A survey of back alley tenements in Kanda, carried out in the 1880s, reveals the conditions within which half the city's population lived. This study found that population density in the ward's poorest neighborhoods was 2,121 people per hectare, almost 4 times the population density of the Kanda ward as a whole. And this meant that 17 families occupied an area of 178 meters. The apartment buildings themselves occupied about 80% of a given property, meaning that the shared facilities, toilets, wells, and garbage dumps, were cramped tightly together in the remaining area. Typically, a single toilet in this kind of a back alley tenement was used by 5 households, so perhaps as many as 20 people or more. And according to this report that I've been drawing upon, under such conditions, quote, there is no doubt that dirty water from garbage and excrement is seeping into wells. So this is the view of poor neighborhoods. that would shape the response of cholera over the next several decades. But I want to say that it is unclear if, in fact, these areas had higher rates of cholera than more prosperous neighborhoods. Because public health data was collected only at the level of the ward, it's really impossible to make comparisons about neighborhoods. Nonetheless, this claim that cholera was a disease of the unhygienic poor whose waste seeped into the water supply and threatened the city as a whole came to prevail, even though those who were stigmatized had little control over the conditions within which they lived. Now, in 1877, in anticipation that cholera, which was then raging in China, would make its way to Japan, the Home Ministry issued instructions for the prevention of cholera to the prefectural governments, and it laid out a very detailed plan for controlling the disease. It began with reporting requirements issued to doctors and others, and once a case of cholera was reported, this was then to trigger a cascade of new responsibilities for local officials who were charged with posting a notice on a home that's clearly stated that a cholera patient was on the premises. They were to ensure that proper disinfection of the home took place. They were to ensure that any waste from patients was disposed of properly in designated locations. They were to inspect toilets and garbage dumps and drainage gutters and to ensure that they were clean. They were to oversee the transfer of anyone who was infected with cholera to a quarantine hospital. More about that later. So these instructions likely proved difficult for cash-strapped local governments around Japan to fully implement, but in Tokyo, this situation was exacerbated by bureaucratic tensions. Now, to this point and elsewhere in the country, public health was under the authority of local governments, although it was subject to direction from the Home Ministry. This changed, however, in 1874 when the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Bureau was established as a branch of the central government. So the establishment of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police reflected the idea that Tokyo, because it was the capital, was an area of national concern. And so its security and peace and all of these things were beyond the scope of the prefectural government. And so the new Tokyo Metropolitan Police were given authority over many aspects of urban life. They were charged with control of entertainment facilities, theaters, brothels, sumo competition. They were to supervise restaurants and inns, and they were also to have authority over public health. Now, the authority of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police not only challenged the prevailing view that public health was a local civil concern, it also introduced new confusion to attempts to respond to cholera. For a time, both the Tokyo Metropolitan Police and the prefectural government claimed authority to deal with cholera. And there was no mechanism for collaboration between the two bodies. And so it was not long before jurisdictional tensions began to emerge. The first case of cholera in Tokyo in 1877 was reported in September 14. And over the next month, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police issued a series of directives. And these came into conflict with the prefecture's efforts, leading, for example, to the creation of two different systems of quarantine hospitals. Now, one of the things that proved most contentious in this jurisdictional struggle was the Tokyo Metropolitan Police's regulation that restricted the removal of human waste from the city to the evening hours. So you were only supposed to clean toilets between 6 p.m. and 7 a.m. And so this had a real impact upon not only city life, but also the villagers outside the city of Tokyo, who were the ones that were doing this labor of collecting waste. It disrupted their schedule of agricultural work to have to come into the city in the evening. It increased the cost of travel because they had to travel and work by lamplight. And they would say that it increased the danger of fire within the city. And this was a very real concern in Tokyo, which was a city constructed of wood and paper and thatch. So the prefecture was very sympathetic to these complaints, but they told those who were unhappy to complain to the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, who promptly rejected the request to make any kinds of changes. Now, in the aftermath of the 1877 outbreak, the Home Ministry tried to clarify who was to do what. It ordered the Metropolitan Police to confer with the prefecture about everything. This was not very helpful advice. And eventually, the ministry issued a clearer delineation of the authority of the two agencies. So the police became responsible for prevention, enforcing travel bans on traffic, and carrying out the inspection, quarantine, and disinfection of public transportation. And they were charged with also patrolling the quarantine hospitals. Meanwhile, the civil authorities, the Tokyo Prefectural authorities, were given authority over treatment, the establishment, and the administration of quarantine hospitals. This didn't really settle matters, but there was a kind of delineation of roles here. Now, the relationship between these two organizations would be tested when cholera returned to Tokyo in 1879 for what would be the most devastating outbreak of the post-1868 period. In Tokyo, the Metropolitan Police immediately assumed control of efforts to manage the disease. And they issued a flurry of orders beginning in June and continuing until December. These required temporal restrictions on the human manure trade, ban on traffic near residences of an infected person, things that had been tried before. But there were new requirements as well, and many of these disproportionately affected the city's poor. The police made the residents of tenements, not the property owners or landlords, responsible for the regular cleaning of streets and drains and the maintaining of the toilets in hygienic condition. So much of the day-to-day labor of cholera prevention became the responsibility of the poor and working class of the city rather than the propertied residents. In addition, new regulations for toilets required that the often leaky wooden waste containers be replaced with expensive ceramic ones. However, no mention was made of who was responsible for the cost of such repairs, and this was a significant issue because the vast majority of Tokyo residents, in fact, lived in some form of rental housing. As cholera cases continued to proliferate, the poor bore the burden of other new restrictions. A case in point was the regulation banning the sale of the clothing and bedding of cholera patients. It makes perfect sense on public health grounds, but clothing and bedding were often the only assets of poor people, and these could be pawned or sold to raise much needed cash. Similarly, members of a household where somebody had died of cholera or recovered or been transferred to a quarantine hospital were forbidden from working in any business that involved food or drink for a period of 7 days. And this was a regulation that affected a broad swath of working class Tokyo residents who did things like making tofu or other foodstuffs, or running food stalls, or peddling vegetables or fish. Now, if the police claimed control over city residents for purposes of cholera prevention, the prefecture still retained some control of the built environment of the city. And one of the moves the prefecture made, was to announce the closing of the street side toilets, which I talked about a few minutes ago, citing that their lack of hygiene, but also their interference with the movement of peoples and goods. And so by 1887, the city had closed about 80% of the toilets. And although some were rebuilt, the total number of toilets was reduced substantially to only about 260. Now, no one, it seems, considered what the lack of a public toilet might mean for the overall cleanliness of the city. So this is this kind of problem, right, that they attack what they see as the cause of the spread of cholera, but they create a condition that in fact made things worse. Now, among the efforts to prevent and control the spread of cholera, nothing was more controversial than the isolation of the sick in quarantine hospitals. And these became the most visible and sustained method of cholera control over the course of about 40 years. The use of quarantine hospitals to control cholera was, to be sure, not unique to Japan. In the 1830s, they were used in cities in both Europe and the US, although compulsory quarantine often met with considerable resistance from the public. In Japan, the initial guidelines for quarantine hospitals were issued by the Home Ministry in 1877, and local officials were authorized when appropriate to compel the confinement of cholera patients in quarantine hospitals. The Home Ministry offered only a few directions. The construction of the hospitals was to be simple. Patients were to be divided in 3 wards based upon the severity of their symptoms. Hospitals had to display a yellow flag with the Q for quarantine on it, and no one was to be released unless completely recovered. The term chosen for the new facilities, which is hibyoin in Japanese, literally meant facility for the avoidance of disease. And so it strongly implied that the function of a quarantine hospital was not to care for the sick, but to protect the uninfected from the sick. And in fact, that is what they were used to do. Now in Tokyo, local officials quickly moved to establish quarantine hospitals as soon as the first cases of cholera appeared in the city. The prefecture announced the opening of 3 facilities for cholera victims in Shiba, down here, Fukagawa. Oh, this is Fukagawa, sorry, Shiba. I'm sorry, it's off my map here. But these 3 were the one, I'm sorry, this one, and this one were the ones run by the prefecture. And then the Tokyo Metropolitan Police opened 4 hospitals of its own. Now, the prefectural hospitals were actually on the site, the prefectural quarantine hospitals were on the site of medical institutions, the prefectural hospital and its branches. In contrast, the police hospitals were located on sites that were strongly associated with state power, on the grounds of the Ichigaya prison, on property held by the military, and on the grounds of a school. So there was this interesting kind of difference in the way these institutions were imagined in the minds of those who created them. Now, initially, it was unclear who was to be confined in the new institutions, but gradually, from late September and into October, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police issued a series of decrees that addressed this issue. The first such decree announced that people infected with cholera who made use of communal toilets should be transferred to the closest quarantine hospital, regardless of wealth or poverty. A week later, another decree was issued. It required that students and others living in boarding houses or similar lodgings be required to be transferred to a quarantine hospital if they fell ill. A subsequent edict added travelers, those without a fixed residence, boatmen, and anyone who worked on the water to be subject to confinement. And this was followed by an edict that reiterated the type of individuals previously specified, but added as well poor people who have no property. The next day, the police expanded its list to include, quote, those who lack caution, and thus threatened to spread the disease. So in spite of the initial statement that wealthy cholera victims too could be quarantined, clearly Tokyo's poor residents were far more likely to face quarantine than others in the city. The procedure in place required doctors or the family to notify local police if a case of cholera was suspected, and the police then had the authority to decide whether a patient could be quarantined at home or should be removed to a quarantine hospital. The rules for home quarantine were elaborate. The patient needed to be isolated from the rest of the household in a private room with access to separate toilet facilities, and was care provided by a single family member who would have no contact with anyone but the patient. So obviously it would have been impossible for those living in the city's tenements to abide by such rules. In Tokyo as elsewhere, the quarantine hospitals for cholera victims met with fear and suspicion. The early facilities were hastily constructed wooden structures that housed only 20 or 30 people at a time, many of whom arrived already severely ill. From the outside, the hospitals adopted a number of unpopular restrictive measures. No visitors were allowed, patients were forbidden to leave, and to ensure that no one entered or left without permission, a policeman was positioned at the entrance. In addition, patients were required to turn over all personal belongings when they were hospitalized, and these were returned only when they had been disinfected, a process that often left clothing discolored and damaged. However, those who were discharged stinking of carbolic acid were the lucky ones of the patients confined. In the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Hospitals in 1877, 70% of patients died. The prefectural hospitals did only slightly better, with a mortality rate of 67%. It was not long before sensational rumors began to circulate about quarantine hospitals. A Tokyo Metropolitan Police directive on November 2nd, 1877, warned Tokyo residents about spreading rumors. And it gave some examples of the rumors that were spreading. For example, it was being said that patients were being drained of blood or having their livers stolen. In at least one instance, suspicion of the hospitals led to violence. Late on the night of November 18th, one hospital in Tokyo was firebombed. Now, the quarantine hospitals were by intention temporary facilities, and by early January 1878, all of Tokyo's hospitals were burned to the ground, together with all their furnishings and any remaining supplies. The practice of destroying the hospitals meant that with each subsequent epidemic, the prefecture, now with its authority over quarantine hospitals established, was able to experiment with their placement. And I'll just quickly show you some of the where these hospitals were. So you see in 1877, they were mainly the ones on the western side of my map were in really well-populated areas, and the ones on the left side of my image were less populated areas of the city. And here you can see in 1879, they experimented with moving all of the hospitals to the periphery of the city. And this posed a lot of difficulty because patients had to be transported by rickshaw or on a stretcher long distances through the city. And then you see here, this is 1882 and 1886. And I tried to think about the relationship between where the hospitals were and where the largest number of cases of cholera were. And you can see that the relationship is not that clear. And often the hospitals were not very close to the wards that had lots of cases of cholera. And this is the situation in 1890. So at this point in 1890, the prefectural government abandons the idea of temporary quarantine hospitals. And so they established 4 what they call infectious disease hospitals, and these would remain through the rest of the period. And because they were stable institutions, not only were the facilities themselves better, but the staff was also better educated and better trained. So this marks a kind of turning point in the way the city is reacting to cholera. There was also another change about that time, and that is that finally, after more than 2 decades, improvements to the water supply system began. In 1893, construction finally got underway, although it progressed very slowly. By 1911, 70% of households in the wards that had the highest incidence of cholera, 70% still relied upon aqueduct or well water, the old aqueduct or well water. So the situation got better, but slowly. So let me quickly conclude. As repeated cholera epidemics ravaged Tokyo in the late 19th century, local and national officials recognized the relationship between the disease, the water supply, and sanitation in the city. Now, elsewhere in the world, in other cities, including New York, London, Paris, and Hamburg, fear of cholera propelled expensive infrastructure projects, most notably the construction of underground sewers. However, in Tokyo, although repeated studies exposed the contamination of the water supply, no sustained efforts were made to address the problems of the city's infrastructure, primarily because the cash-strapped central government had other priorities, including industrialization and the expansion of the country's military, and the prefectural government simply did not have the funds to undertake big infrastructure projects. So public health officials attempted to control the spread of the disease by regulating the everyday life of cities' residents. Not only were they subject to a host of onerous rules and regulations that disrupted the fabric of everyday life, cities' residents were also made responsible for sanitary improvements, including the cleaning and disinfection of streets, wells, drains, and the renovation of toilets. But cholera exposed more than the problematic priorities of the government. It also revealed the social, economic, and material inequities that shaped urban life in Tokyo. Poor and working class residents who lived in Tokyo's western wards were disproportionately vulnerable to cholera because of circumstances beyond their control, such as their lack of access to clean water and sanitary facilities. And they were also disproportionately affected by the quarantine policy. Although middle-class Tokyoites were allowed to quarantine at home, the poor could be forcibly removed to quarantine hospitals. Ironically, it is unclear whether the new regulations for the quarantine hospitals, which proved to be so divisive, played a meaningful role in controlling the spread of cholera. Epidemics continued in the 20th century, until the 20th century, when the construction of a modern water supply and improvements in sanitation finally proved effective at stopping the spread of the disease. But if attempts to control cholera in Tokyo ultimately failed until the 20th century, the web of new regulations and the new institutions ultimately accomplished something that I think is more important. By the end of the 19th century, Tokyo's residents had embraced the central logic of every modern public health system. That is, that bodily health is a legitimate object of government concern and control. Fear of cholera became a justification for governmental action, but it propelled as well a new willingness of the citizenry to view public health initiatives, burdensome and inequitable as they were, as both a responsibility and an obligation. And that, I think, is the real legacy of the era of cholera in Tokyo. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burns, for that wonderful, wonderful talk. And we probably have time for maybe a few quick questions. So if anyone has any, please feel free to put them down there in the Q&A box. And I'm actually kind of curious, since cholera was coming in through these ports of foreign trade like Nagasaki, was there any backlash after the country was opened up by Commodore Perry that they should sort of close back down because sort of there was now this disease coming into Japan?
Yeah, I think it created a lot of anti-foreign sentiment. And so in the first epidemic in 1822, one of the widespread rumors was that foreigners were poisoning the wells. So even at this moment, people recognized that there was something going on with water, but not understanding the mechanism of the spread of the disease, they fell back on this idea that there was malicious intent on the part of foreigners who were spreading the disease. So I think there was a recognition certainly that it would be impossible to close the country again just because of international pressure. But there was certainly, I think, widespread resentment at the inability to carry out maritime quarantines and keep the disease from coming into the country. And so this is one of the things that is creating anti-foreign sentiment in Japan in the 1870s and 80s.
Okay. We have a couple of questions coming in. Oh, we have someone who is researching the history of night soil in modern China. So they were particularly interested by the toilet stuff. Do you have more details on how the cholera epidemics influenced the night soil economy in and around Tokyo at this time?
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic, and I learned a lot about night soil and toilets in Tokyo working on this chapter. So one of the things that begins to happen is that over the going into the 20th century, there's this question of who is responsible for cleaning the toilets. Is it a responsibility of the city government? They take it on, or is it a private arrangement between the night soil merchants and individual homeowners? Because depending on how far night soil had to be carried out of the city, it was more or less a profitable business. So for some night soil collectors who were working in good conditions, that they could put it on a boat, for example, and move it down the Sumida River, it was a very profitable business. But over time, it was less profitable for night soil dealers in other parts of the city, and they would abandon it. But then people were still relying on toilets that were needed to be cleaned out. And so what we see over the long term happening is that the divisiveness of the night soil trade and the differing price structure that emerged encouraged the city to take on responsibility. And that's what begins to happen in the second decade of the 20th century. I should say, though, it's a very efficient system. And so it's not really until the post-war period that, people are not necessarily relying upon night soil tradesmen to clean their toilets. It lasts for quite a long time because it is efficient and there is a value to the night soil.
And okay, we have another question. And you mentioned that the government was unable to quarantine the foreign soldiers. Just curious, why was the government unable to assert itself with these foreign navies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we have to remember that the government of Japan was established only in 1868. So it's a very new government. It's a cash-strapped government. And, some people refer to Japan as sort of semi-colonized in this period because you have these ports which are basically under foreign control: Yokohama, Nagasaki, Hakodate, Kobe, where foreigners run their own courts. They control the price of import and export duties and taxes and so on. And so, the Japanese government makes a strong case that other countries are using maritime quarantine to control the spread of cholera, that this is an international norm, and therefore it should be allowed to do so as well. But interestingly, countries like Great Britain and Germany that are using maritime quarantine refuse to allow Japan to do it. And Japan is just a weak, poor country that is not in a position to resist at that point. So, I guess we see here this sort of inequality of countries on the world stage is also something that is playing into how cholera is dealt with internationally.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we are pretty much right on the hour. But I do have to ask, just because I'm deeply curious, the Cholera Deity. Was kind of this idea of the Cholera Deity, is that new when cholera comes in, or was there kind of an existing structure in Shinto that was already kind of dealing with diseases?
Yeah, so interestingly, epidemic diseases in particular, I suppose because that seems so unfathomable, right? That a disease emerges at a certain moment and kills a lot of people and then goes away. So both smallpox and measles were also associated with epidemic deities, a smallpox deity and a measles deity. And so when cholera comes in, and it is another one of these inexplicable diseases, it sort of brought into this paradigm as well. And so even though, it's a new disease, it comes to be understood in a very established sense. And so you find this idea that there is a cholera deity, and many of the kinds of ritual ways that were used to deal with an outbreak of smallpox or an outbreak of measles are also brought to bear on cholera. So, you know, I think in 1858, some people did the New Year festival kinds of things early, with the idea that if it's a new year, it's a new beginning, and maybe that will make the deity go away. So to me, it's quite interesting that it is this kind of level of folk belief. People are able to take a radically new disease, but incorporate it into existing belief systems.
Okay.
That's a great question.
It's really interesting. Okay, we are pretty much right at the hour. So once again, thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Thank you so much. And I apologize for talking on so long, but
No,
if anybody has
problem.
further questions that I didn't get an answer, if it didn't get a chance to answer, feel free to write to me at my UChicago email address. It's slburns@uchicago.edu, and I'll be happy to try and respond.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.